Are the Balkans building Europe's future, or repeating its past mistakes? This question now sits quietly on the desks of policymakers across Brussels and Washington. For years, the Balkans existed in Europe's shadow, too near to ignore, too complex to absorb. But in 2025, that ambiguity is ending. Capital is flowing back, Brussels is rewriting its strategic map, and global powers are once again testing influence on the same ground where empires once collided. The issue is no longer if the Balkans will join Europe, but on whose terms that integration will happen. In 2024, trade between the Western Balkans and the EU represented more than 65% of total external commerce. Foreign direct investment grew 12% year over year, reaching nearly 20 billion euros. EU cohesion funds expanded from 3 billion euros to 5 billion euros in just 2 years. Inflation rates have begun to converge with EU averages. Serbia around 3.5%, Bosnia 2.9%. Infrastructure gaps persist. Bosnia's broadband penetration is 60% versus the EU's 90%. These indicators reveal a paradoxical region, economically intertwined, politically unsettled. Progress exists, but it is uneven and fragile, dependent on capital that arrives with conditions. The modern Balkan story is one of disintegration followed by slow reintegration. The 1990s brought state collapse, ethnic war, and institutional vacuum. The 2000s saw a wave of EU enlargement that skipped most of the Western Balkans, leaving the region in an intermediate state, a Europe-adjacent but not European. Trade deals and visa liberalization kept the European promise alive, but corruption and governance weakness eroded momentum. The result? A generation caught between aspiration and disillusionment. The turning point came when the EU realized its security and supply chain fragility extended into its own backyard. Energy dependence on Russia and China's deepening foothold in infrastructure forced Brussels to look southeast again. Accession talks accelerated, conditional funding expanded, institutional alignment re-entered the agenda. Meanwhile, China and Turkey advanced through strategic investments, ports, railways, and industrial zones. For the first time in 2 decades, alignment with EU norms was no longer symbolic but transactional. What had once been a promise became a bargaining tool and a test of sovereignty. The Balkans' path toward the EU is no longer a linear process of reform. It's a strategic equilibrium between 3 interlocking forces: convergence, dependency, and competition. Convergence. To attract capital and gain access to EU funds, Balkan economies must reform their institutions, stabilize their currencies, and harmonize with EU regulatory standards. This process fosters modernization, but also enforces policy uniformity. Dependency. The same reforms that open the door to European funding often create reliance on external financing and expertise. Domestic fiscal autonomy weakens as infrastructure, energy, and even governance reforms become externally designed. Competition. Global powers, China, Russia, and Turkey, use trade, energy, and culture as instruments of influence. Each project, from transport corridors to digital infrastructure, becomes a tool of strategic alignment. The outcome is a form of asymmetric integration. The Balkans are joining Europe economically, while negotiating the limits of their political sovereignty. In effect, they're not only testing their readiness for Europe, they're testing Europe's ability to remain coherent under pressure. As the Balkans edge closer to Europe's core, the next decade could unfold along 3 distinct paths, each revealing a different version of what integration truly means. This is not about predicting the future, it is about defining the range of possibilities. The interaction between political reform, economic dependency, and regional autonomy will shape which of these paths emerges dominant. Every scenario represents a different balance between Brussels' strategic imperatives and local political capacity. Baseline scenario: Slow but stable convergence. Incremental reform continues as EU funds keep flowing. Governance improves gradually. Corruption declines but does not disappear. Economic growth stabilizes around 3% annually, driven by manufacturing and services linked to EU value chains. Yet institutional fragility and outmigration limit innovation. In this scenario, the Balkans remain economically integrated but politically semi-peripheral. Inside the market, outside the decision room. Accelerated integration. Geopolitics as a catalyst. A new security logic dominates Brussels. The EU fast-tracks accession for select states to contain external influence and strengthen its southeastern flank. Membership for Serbia or Montenegro becomes plausible by the late 2020s. Foreign direct investment soars, infrastructure expands, and regional trade intensifies. However, institutions struggle to absorb rapid change. Corruption risks re-emerge. Populist politics exploit reform fatigue. The region converges faster, but on a foundation still fragile. Fragmentation scenario. Reform fatigue and reversal. Economic pressure, polarization, and external debt triggers political backlash. Public trust in European integration erodes. Youth migration accelerates. Investor confidence drops. Authoritarian tendencies grow under the pretext of stability. China and Turkey fill the void with bilateral deals and strategic investments. In this trajectory, the Balkans drift back toward a gray zone, neither fully aligned nor fully independent. No matter which scenario prevails, the Balkans will define Europe's ability to manage complexity without central control. They are not simply catching up to Europe, they are testing whether Europe can still expand its values while containing its vulnerabilities.
The most serious vulnerability is the gap between capital inflows and institutional capacity. EU money arrives faster than governance can absorb it. Foreign currency borrowing creates exposure to exchange rate shocks. Judicial independence remains limited, allowing clientelist networks to capture reform funds. Infrastructure projects often prioritize political visibility over economic viability. Public support for integration wanes when citizens see reform as an elite exercise. Without trust, no amount of funding can secure stability.
The Balkans stand once again at a historic crossroads. The question is not when they will enter the European Union, but who they will be when they do. Will integration mean empowerment or absorption? And if alignment erodes sovereignty, will societies still see it as progress? What the Balkans decide in this decade will not only reshape their own future, but test Europe's capacity to remain a union of nations, not just a market of members. If strategy, history, economics, and finance shape the world, this is where they converge. Subscribe now and join the conversation.